I recently had to relocate to a new city for work. My family, which consists of me, my wife, Emma, and our 9-year-old son, Ethan, was suddenly uprooted from our quiet life and moved to a much busier city, something none of us were accustomed to. Emma had to find a new job in the city, and Ethan had to leave his friends behind to start at a new school. I hoped the major pay raise I was receiving would make all of this worth it. We've been settled into our new house for about a month now, and it seems like everyone is adjusting to this new lifestyle. Emma found a job that she enjoys and has already made a few friends there. Ethan has also settled in well at his new school. He's in 3rd grade now, and because this city is much larger, his class is bigger than what he was used to. I don't think it bothers him too much. He's already made a few new friends who have helped him adjust. His teacher, Mrs. Brown, is a young woman, around 30, and Ethan really seems to like her. He would come home every day and tell me and Emma all about the fun he had and the interesting lessons Mrs. Brown would teach. I only met her once when I dropped Ethan off on his first day, and she seemed very nice. Every evening, Ethan would come home with a different homework task that he needed to complete before school the next day. I'm not a huge fan of homework, but the tasks Mrs. Brown assigned seemed to be simple enough to finish in one night. One night, Ethan had to ask a parent what they did for a living and ask them 3 questions about their job. Another time, he had to research his favorite animal and find 3 interesting facts about it. It was always easy stuff or simple worksheets that he could finish in about half an hour. Each night, I'd ask Ethan about his homework, and I'd help him if he needed it. But one night, something seemed off. About 3 weeks into the new school year, Ethan came home looking upset. I asked him what was wrong, but he said everything was fine. When I asked about his homework, he told me he didn't have any for the night, which was strange because he'd always had some kind of task every night since he started Mrs. Brown's class. He then left the kitchen and went to his room, closing the door behind him. Ethan didn't usually close his door, but I assumed he wanted some privacy. Still, I could tell something was bothering him, though he wasn't ready to talk about it. Ethan spent most of the evening in his room, except for dinner time when Emma and I insisted he join us at the table. He seemed to be in a better mood during dinner, making jokes and talking as usual. After dinner, though, he went back to his room and shut the door. We let him be for a while, but after an hour or 2, I went in to tell him it was time for bed. I walked to his room, opened the door, and found him asleep at his desk, his workbook in front of him. I quietly went over to wake him up and move him to his bed, but that's when I noticed the homework. The task written at the top of his workbook was, "Would I miss my parents if I no longer lived with them?" I was taken aback. This seemed like a very strange assignment for 3rd graders. I wasn't sure how to react, but I kept reading to see what Ethan had written. He had written, "I would miss both my mom and dad very much. I love them both a lot, and they help me with everything. I love spending dinner time with them, but I would probably love someone else just as much as them if I had to. Like you were saying today, Mrs. Brown." The last sentence sent chills down my spine. I would probably love someone else just as much as them if I had to. What had Mrs. Brown been telling my son? What was her purpose in saying such things? I decided not to tell Emma just yet. She would worry, and maybe she had every right to, but I didn't want to cause her more stress. Instead, I decided to confront Mrs. Brown the next day. The following morning, I dropped Ethan off at school, but this time, I walked him to his classroom. I saw Mrs. Brown alone in the room, and she greeted me with a smile. "Hi, how's Ethan settling in?" she asked as I entered. I told her he was adjusting well, but I had a few concerns. She asked what they were, and I explained. "I'm curious about the homework you gave yesterday, about how much the kids would miss their parents." It seemed like a strange and intense question to ask 3rd graders. "And Ethan wrote that he might love someone else just as much as us, like you told him. Could you explain that?" She let out a slight laugh. Oh, that. Yesterday, we were talking about how parents love and protect their kids, but also how there are other people who would be there to help them if they needed it. Her answer didn't sit well with me, and I was about to press further when suddenly a large group of kids entered the classroom. They all filed in, walking in 2 neat rows. They greeted Mrs. Brown one by one, and they seemed unusually well-behaved, almost too well-behaved. I watched as Ethan sat next to one of the students, who was staring straight ahead with their arms crossed. All the other students were doing the same, staring at Mrs. Brown. Something felt off, but I assumed this was just their morning routine. I left, still uneasy about the homework, but decided to wait and see if anything else unusual happened. I picked Ethan up from school early that day and drove to the school. When the bell rang, most of the kids poured out of the gates, running and shouting, except Mrs. Brown's class. They all walked out in perfect formation, marching in time. It was eerie. I'd never seen such discipline, especially after the bell had rung. Ethan climbed into the car without a word and just stared ahead. I asked him if he was okay, but he simply replied, "Yes." We drove home in silence. As soon as we got inside, Ethan went straight to his room and closed the door. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what. Later, Emma came home, and I told her everything that had been happening. She grew more and more concerned as I spoke. "Maybe I should go talk to him," she suggested after I finished explaining. I agreed, and she went to Ethan's room while I waited in the living room. About 15 minutes later, Ethan walked into the living room holding a small notebook. "Can you help me with my homework, Dad?" he asked. "Of course," I replied, taking the notebook from him. The homework task for the night read, "Research the best way to inject your parents with anesthetic." I barely finished reading the sentence when I felt a sharp pain in my neck. I looked down and saw a needle sticking out of my skin. Ethan was holding the other end, his face blank. Everything started to go black. The last thing I saw was Ethan's vacant stare as I collapsed to the floor. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but I woke up to Emma screaming and crying. When I looked up at her, I saw the small pinprick on her neck. She had been injected too. I tried to move, but I was still too groggy. I managed to grab my phone and called the police. They promised to send officers to look for Ethan. I also called the school, and the receptionist told me that none of Mrs. Brown's class had shown up that day, and that Mrs. Brown hadn't either. It's been 3 weeks since Ethan disappeared, along with Mrs. Brown and the rest of the class. All the parents have the same story. They were injected by their own children, and when they woke up, their kids were gone. No one knows where they went, but we all have the same questions. Are they all together? Is Mrs. Brown with them? Was this planned? Why were the kids acting so strangely? Had they been hypnotized or drugged? Or was something far darker at play?